I was halfway through my lunch break in downtown Houston when my phone lit up with a call from a number I didn't recognize. Normally, I might have let it go to voicemail, but something nagged at me to pick up. The voice on the other end was frantic. An old friend from my hometown, practically shouting that someone was building mansions on the land I'd inherited from my grandfather. I almost choked on my sandwich. 50 mansions, he clarified, huge ones, some kind of flashy development, and from what I can tell, they're right there on your land, no question about it. My heart pounded. My grandfather's farmland was in rural Texas, about an hour and a half outside of Houston, and as far as I knew, I had never sold an inch of it. Stunned, I asked for details. He didn't know much, only that the local homeowners association, led by a woman named Diane, was spearheading some luxury project. I felt my blood pressure spike, along with a sting of guilt for not checking on the property more frequently. The farmland my grandfather's pride and joy lay on the outskirts of a small town where I grew up. It was quiet, dusty, and fiercely independent. Our town thrived on the traditions of old family ranches, a handful of small businesses, and an unspoken code of neighborly respect. My grandfather was one of those die-hard Texans who believed in community, personal liberty, and the sanctity of one's own land. He had raised me after my parents passed away in a car accident, and he always emphasized that I should guard the farm's boundaries diligently. He claimed he had a suspicion that some big shot might come sniffing around one day, looking to expand. That's why he left me not just the deed, but also a trove of documents, maps, and notes about the property's original boundary lines. At the time, I thought he was being overly cautious. Now, with my friend insisting that 100 mansions were going up, I realized maybe my grandfather had seen this coming all along. I ended my shift early, jumped into my old pickup truck, and headed straight out of the city. As the urban skyline faded in my rearview mirror, I tried calling local officials to see if there were building permits filed under my name or for my property. Nobody gave me a straight answer. A clerk at the county office said, "I see a large-scale development listed near that area, but it's under Glendale Meadows HOA. Are you sure it's your land?" The question had me rattled. Of course I was sure. But as the miles ticked by, doubt began to creep in. Could I have overlooked a letter, missed some notice? Did the farmland somehow change hands without my knowledge? It seemed unlikely, yet the possibility gnawed at me. By the time I approached the outskirts of town, the sun had dipped low, painting the sky in dusky reds and oranges. The farmland in question was about 10 minutes off the main highway, down a winding country road. I slowed down as I neared the turn, scanning for any sign of the rumored construction. But first I saw nothing but the familiar open fields and the occasional cluster of mesquite trees. Then I crested a small hill and my headlights illuminated what looked like the framework of several enormous houses. My stomach lurched. The frames stretched in neat rows, each skeleton of wood beams hinting at future luxury. These were not simple ranch houses. They were tall, sprawling structures with multiple wings, likely intended to be multi-million-dollar mansions. I counted at least 10 under construction right there in the moonlight. When my friend said 50, I'd thought he was exaggerating. Now I believed him completely. I parked on the side of the road, hopped out, and walked closer. Construction materials were strewn everywhere. A large sign read, "Glendale Meadows, Luxury Living in the Heart of Texas." My heart thundered with a mix of anger and confusion. Glendale Meadows. Glendale was a small, planned community several miles away, and I'd heard rumors about an aggressive homeowners association that ran it. I remembered hearing about a woman named Diane, someone who had gained a reputation for using her connections in local government to expand the HOA's footprint. But I'd never dreamed she would set her sights on my grandfather's land, especially without so much as a notice or a phone call. Before I could process the situation, the roar of a truck engine made me turn around. A security guard approached, shining a flashlight in my eyes. "Private property," he barked. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." My temper flared. "This property belongs to me," I shot back, squinting against the glare. He stared at me, clearly uncertain. "You with Glendale Meadows?" he asked in a more measured tone. I shook my head. "No. I'm the legal owner of this land." They're trespassing, not me. He mumbled something into his walkie-talkie before muttering, "Ma'am, I need to see some ID or something." I fumbled for my driver's license and stepped closer. The confusion on his face turned to mild panic as he read my name. I don't know anything about the ownership," he stammered. "I just got hired by the HOA to keep people away from the site." That was all I needed to hear. HOA or not, they had no business building on a property that wasn't theirs. I left, promising myself I'd be back first thing in the morning. My first stop was the tiny motel in town, which fortunately had a vacancy. Exhausted and furious, I tried calling the Glendale Meadows HOA office, but it went straight to voicemail. For hours I tossed and turned, replaying the guard's words and the sight of those half-built mansions. Then I remembered my grandfather's old documents. He had always said, "If ever there's a dispute, check my files. Everything you need is there." At dawn, I drove to the old farmhouse that once served as our family home, determined to find those papers. The building was dusty and cluttered, but it still held a comforting familiarity. The floors creaked in just the same places as when I was a child, and I could practically smell my grandfather's morning coffee lingering in the walls. Rummaging through his study, I found a battered metal box behind a false panel in his desk. Inside were a weathered notebook, an ancient property map, and a series of typed letters. My grandfather's handwriting covered the notebook pages, some dated as far back as the 1980s. One entry made my heart skip. "Been hearing chatter about Glendale's expansion. Boundaries might be tested. If you're reading this, be careful. Certain folks have no respect for rightful owners." Taped to the back of the notebook was a smaller envelope labeled "Original Deed and Survey, 1925. My grandfather had carefully stored the official documents that showed our land's true boundaries, including a mention of a creek at the southern edge and an oak grove to the north. I recognized those landmarks. They'd always served as the corners of the property in my mind. Equipped with this evidence, I marched over to the county recorder's office. The clerk on duty seemed surprised to see such old documents, but dutifully pulled up the digital records. Sure enough, the computer system showed that the Glendale Meadows HOA had recently filed a new survey, shifting the southern property line by about half a mile north. That might sound small, but over a wide swath of land, it covered enough area to fit 50 mansion lots comfortably. I felt my nails dig into my palms. The clerk squinted at my documents, then at her screen, and said quietly, "These older records override any modern ones if there was no legitimate transfer of ownership. But you might want to get a lawyer." She printed everything out, gave me a look of pity mixed with encouragement, and advised me to talk to the county surveyor. My next stop was the surveyor's office, a cramped space in the back of the county administration building. The official there, a man named Charlie, was a longtime friend of my grandfather. He remembered me as a child, running around the farmland, chasing after our old barn cat. Charlie greeted me warmly but grew serious when I explained what was happening. He inspected the documents carefully, nodding every so often. "Your grandfather's boundary lines are well documented," he remarked. "Whoever filed this new survey for the HOA must have either overlooked these records or deliberately ignored them. If it's the latter, that's fraud." My frustration deepened, but Charlie's expertise was a glimmer of hope. He said he could conduct a fresh survey, confirming the original lines, and testify in court if needed. We scheduled a date which was unfortunately 2 weeks away because of Charlie's workload. Realizing the construction wouldn't stop in the meantime, I needed urgent legal advice. The next person on my list was an attorney, Marcia Hall, who specialized in property disputes. She was known for her fierce courtroom presence and her unstoppable devotion to her clients. I half expected her to laugh me out of her office. I didn't have much money to offer as a retainer, but instead she listened carefully, studying the old documents and the new digital ones, making notes on a yellow legal pad. "We can file for a temporary restraining order," she said. "If the judge grants it, we can at least pause the construction until this boundary issue is sorted out." but we'll need solid proof that the HOA is building on your land and that the official records are being misrepresented." I pointed to the maps. "We have that proof," I said firmly. She smiled. "Then let's give them a fight." Armed with Marcia's confidence, I left her office feeling more in control. However, the very next day, I got a rude awakening. I went out to check on the farmland again, only to find the entrance to the main dirt road blocked by large construction vehicles and a sign that read "No trespassing, property of Glendale Meadows." My chest tightened with indignation. How dare they label my land as theirs? A foreman approached and I calmly tried to explain the situation, but he just shrugged. "My orders come from Diane. She says we own it, so we build." That was the first time I heard Diane's name confirmed in connection to the project, and I vowed to speak with her face to face. I managed to get her number from the Glendale Meadows HOA website and called. She answered on the second ring, her tone as smooth as silk. "Yes, this is Diane. How can I help you?" I introduced myself, explained who I was, and laid out my side of the story. She barely let me finish before cutting in. "I'm sorry, but Glendale Meadows has all the legal documentation for this development. If you have an issue, take it up with the county. We have every right to build here." My temper rose. "You're building on land that's been in my family for nearly a century. Don't you think we should at least sit down and look at the historical documents?" She let out a dismissive laugh that echoed in my ear. "Those documents are outdated. We have updated surveys. Good day." Then she hung up. Shaken but resolute, I took Marcia's advice and filed for a temporary restraining order at the county courthouse. To my relief, the judge agreed to hold a hearing within the week, citing the urgency of potential land fraud. That gave me a small window to gather more supporting evidence. I spent the following days reaching out to old neighbors and family friends who might have witnessed the original boundary lines. I found an elderly man named Hank who had lived next door to my grandfather since the 1960s. Hank recalled a string of iron markers along the property edge that had been placed decades ago. He even kept an old photograph that showed my grandfather standing near one of those markers with a big "No Trespassing" sign. That photo could prove the boundary line was further south than the HOA's new survey claimed. Meanwhile, I noticed odd inconveniences starting to pile up at the farmhouse. The water got shut off for non-payment, even though I was certain the bill was up to date. Then the electricity flickered off, with the power company citing a maintenance issue. It seemed too coincidental. Later, a county inspector arrived and tried to slap a code violation notice on the barn, claiming it was structurally unsound. The barn had stood for nearly 80 years without a problem. My suspicions grew that Diane might be pulling strings behind the scenes to put pressure on me, hoping I'd give up on the land out of sheer frustration. When I confided these troubles to Marcia, she nodded grimly. "I've seen it before," she said. "HOAs sometimes have deep local connections. Diane might be friendly with utility providers or code enforcement officers. Stay vigilant." That same afternoon, I returned to the property to take more photos of the construction, only to find my path blocked once again. A group of workers snickered as I approached. One of them said, "Better watch out, Diane's got people in high places." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I refused to let fear dictate my actions. I snapped more photos anyway, ignoring their jeers. The hearing day arrived before I knew it. Nervous energy coursed through me as I stood alongside Marcia in the small courtroom. Diane showed up with a pair of attorneys, both wearing expensive suits and smug expressions. The judge looked exasperated as he listened to both sides. Our argument was straightforward. The Glendale Meadows HOA had overstepped the property boundary, ignoring older legally binding deeds and surveys that established my rightful. Diane's lawyers countered that the new survey was the only relevant document and that everything else was historical fluff. They insisted the land was sold to Glendale Meadows fair and square, though they couldn't provide a proper bill of sale. Their claim was that the previous boundary lines had been reassessed. However, Marcia had anticipated that angle. She presented a chain of title documents showing the farmland had never been sold. My grandfather transferred it directly to me. Moreover, she pointed out that any reassessment or shift in property lines without my explicit consent was invalid. To drive the point home, we showed the judge Hank's photograph and explained how iron markers used to be on the southern edge, nowhere near the new development. The judge frowned, shuffling through the evidence. He demanded an explanation from Diane's lawyers. They stammered, referencing clerical errors and public domain confusion. Diane sat there, arms crossed, glaring at me with icy contempt. The judge finally announced he needed more time to review everything, but granted a temporary halt on construction for 1 week, pending further investigation. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was enough to stop them in their tracks, for now. Stepping out of the courtroom, I exhaled a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. My relief was short-lived, though, because Diane cornered me in the hallway. "You're making a mistake," she said in a low voice. "I have connections in this town, and I'm not afraid to use them. This is bigger than you or your little farm." I met her gaze, feeling a surge of determination. "It's my land," I replied. "I won't let you steal it, no matter how big you think you are." She narrowed her eyes. "You'll regret this," she hissed, then stalked off. That night, I reviewed my grandfather's notebook again, searching for any clue that might strengthen my case. In one entry, he wrote, "If Glendale expands south, remember the wetlands along the creek bed. They can't build there without proper environmental approvals." My eyes lit up. Wetlands? My grandfather had often mentioned how that area near the creek was protected by state regulations due to certain wildlife habitats. If Glendale Meadows had extended into those wetlands, they'd be in serious violation of environmental laws. That was a big if, but it was worth investigating. The next morning, I hiked out to the far southern boundary near the creek. Sure enough, the construction sites were uncomfortably close to the water's edge. In some places, workers had even dumped dirt and debris, altering the natural flow of the creek. I took dozens of photos, documenting every sign of possible environmental damage. Armed with this new evidence, I rushed to the local office of the state's environmental agency. The official I spoke to, a weary-looking woman named Linda, grew increasingly alarmed as she flipped through the photographs. "If they're building in a designated wetland area or affecting the creek, they need a specific permit from us," she explained. "I don't see any record of Glendale Meadows applying for that." She assured me she would dispatch an inspector to the site. If her suspicions were correct, Glendale Meadows could face massive fines and be forced to halt construction altogether. Meanwhile, Marcia and I prepared for the next legal step. We drafted a more extensive complaint, charging Glendale Meadows with trespassing, environmental violations, and boundary fraud. The local news started to catch wind of the story, with a couple of reporters calling me for interviews. I was hesitant at first, but Marcia suggested it could help get the public on our side. "Public sentiment matters, especially in smaller communities," she said. "If people see a local landowner being bullied by a powerful HOA, they might rally behind you." So I agreed to speak briefly with a local TV station, explaining how the farmland had been in my family for generations and how I believed Glendale Meadows was building illegally. I stopped short of naming Diane directly, though she was widely known to be in charge. That media attention must have struck a nerve, because the very next evening the farmhouse's windows were pelted with rocks. One of them shattered, sending shards of glass all over my kitchen floor. My heart pounded in my ears as I called the sheriff, but by the time they arrived, whoever threw the rocks was long gone. The deputy took a statement and said he'd keep an eye out, but I had little faith anything would come of it. Shaken and furious, I doubled down on security, installing a few cameras and some motion sensor lights. I refused to be intimidated. As the days went by, tension in the community escalated. Some people supported me openly, especially older neighbors who remembered my grandfather and respected property rights. Others sided with Diane, dazzled by the promise of fancy new mansions that would supposedly elevate the area's status and bring in more revenue. Glendale Meadows' promotional materials touted A new era of luxury living, making it seem like I was just a backward landowner blocking progress. That narrative stung, but I believed in the truth of my documents, in the wetlands protections, and most of all, in my grandfather's foresight. A week later, the next hearing arrived. This time we had the environmental inspector's preliminary report, which noted multiple infractions: unauthorized grading near the creek, potential harm to protected species, and a blatant failure to secure wetland permits. The inspector stood up in court and explained in plain terms how Glendale Meadows had violated both state and federal regulations. Diane's lawyers tried to dismiss it as a misunderstanding, insisting they had initiated the permit process, but the inspector was firm. "Not according to our records," she said, her voice echoing in the hushed courtroom. "You can't initiate a process if you never submit the required forms." The judge listened intently, flipping through the photos of bulldozed land near the creek. He then turned to Diane's lawyers. "This is serious," he said. "Between these environmental concerns and the conflicting boundary claims, I'm inclined to extend the construction halt." Diane visibly clenched her jaw. A forced smile plastered on her face. Then, in a bold move, she requested a full community hearing, a chance to set the record straight, as she put it. The judge, perhaps tired of the back and forth, granted her request, scheduling a public forum at the county hall the following week. That meant the entire community could weigh in on the dispute, and all the evidence would be presented for public scrutiny. I saw Marcia arch an eyebrow, quietly intrigued. It was an unusual step, but one that might work in our favor if we played our cards right. In the days leading up to the community hearing, the local media coverage intensified. The story of how 50 mansions were being built without checking boundaries made for catchy headlines. I received numerous phone calls, some from supportive strangers who praised my fight, others from angry voices who accused me of stalling the progress Glendale Meadows represented. At one point, a small group of protesters even gathered outside the farmhouse, chanting slogans about how I was blocking the future. It was surreal. I never asked for this conflict, but I wasn't about to roll over and let Diane walk all over me. On the morning of the hearing, I felt butterflies in my stomach. Marcia and I arrived early to find the county hall packed with people. Town residents, curious onlookers, prospective mansion buyers who'd already put down deposits, and representatives from the news outlets. Diane and her entourage sat in the front row, exuding an air of quiet confidence. The first half of the forum involved local officials explaining the background, the farmland's contested boundary lines, the new survey Glendale Meadows filed, and the older documents I had. Then they moved on to the environmental violations. The inspector repeated her findings, which drew audible gasps from some audience members who hadn't realized how extensive the damage was. Diane finally took the microphone, flanked by her lawyers. She delivered a polished speech about how Glendale Meadows was modernizing the region, creating jobs and raising property values. She painted me as an obstructionist relying on ancient documents to cling to outdated land claims. She even implied that my grandfather had let the farmland fall into disrepair, which was an outright lie. He had passed away years ago, but he'd kept the land well enough for his age. Her comments stung, and my hands clenched around the edge of my seat. When it was my turn to speak, my voice trembled at first, but I steadied it by focusing on the truth. I explained that the farmland was an inheritance, that I cherished my grandfather's legacy, and that Glendale Meadows had no legitimate proof of purchase. Then I brought out the big guns. The original deed, the 1,925 survey let, my grandfather's meticulously kept notes, and most crucially, the modern survey that Charlie was able to complete just days before. Charlie stepped forward in his official capacity, holding up a sealed report. "Based on my on-site measurements and historical markers," he declared, "the boundary line Glendale Meadows is using is incorrect by several hundred yards. This farmland up to the creek belongs to the family of the current owner." He pointed to me. "I see no record of any legitimate sale or transfer." The crowd murmured, some turning to glare at Diane. One of her lawyers tried to discredit Charlie by suggesting he was biased, But that fell flat when Charlie produced his professional credentials and reminded them he'd been appointed by the county. Marcia then hammered home the environmental violations, presenting additional photographs and pointing out that Glendale Meadows had already begun damaging a protected wetland without approval. "This is not just a matter of private property," Marcia said firmly. "It's also a public concern. If they can destroy wetlands and ignore boundaries, what stops them from doing it elsewhere?" The tension in the room rose to a fever pitch. A few local residents stepped up to the microphone to voice their support for me, citing the farmland's historical importance and how my grandfather had always welcomed them to fish by the creek or gather pecans in the orchard. One resident even teared up, recalling how the farm's open spaces had served as a community meeting spot for church gatherings. On the other side, a couple of prospective mansion buyers complained loudly that they'd already invested in lots with a great view and demanded compensation if the project was halted. The judge, who was presiding over the forum in an official capacity, finally banged his gavel to restore order. After several hours of heated discussion, the judge announced he would rule within the next few days about the future of the project. He warned Diane that if the property indeed belonged to me, Glendale Meadows would face serious repercussions for building without authorization. His words fell on a silent room, everyone hanging on the edge of uncertainty. Diane looked like she wanted to spit nails, but she plastered on a professional smile and left with her entourage, ignoring reporters who tried to question her. By now the lines were clearly drawn. I had the law on my side, provided the judge followed through, and Diane had money, influence, and the loyalty of people who stood to profit from the mansion development. But something about her demeanor suggested there was more to come, as if she believed she still held a trump card. My suspicions were confirmed when I got a call from the sheriff's office the next morning saying that a complaint had been filed against me for harassing construction workers and trespassing on Glendale Meadows property. I laughed in disbelief. How could I trespass on my own land? Nevertheless, I had to go down to the station and answer questions. The sheriff, who knew me since childhood, seemed embarrassed. "I have to follow protocol," he said apologetically. "But it's pretty clear this complaint is bogus. Still, keep your nose clean. They're trying to build a case against you." Frustration mounted, but I reminded myself that every petty move Diane made only weakened her credibility in the eyes of the court. I laid low for a couple of days, focusing on shoring up any details that might help the judge's decision. Then came a flicker of good news. The State Environmental Agency formally ordered Glendale Meadows to stop all construction activities until a thorough wetland assessment could be done. This was independent of the judge's ruling on the boundary, meaning even if Diane tried to speed up building in those final hours, she couldn't. A few more days passed, and at last the judge released his decision. I remember the moment clearly because I was feeding the barn cats when Marcia called me, voice trembling with excitement. "We won," she said simply. My knees almost buckled with relief. According to the judge's ruling, the older deed and the newly confirmed survey proved my land ownership beyond a doubt. Glendale Meadows had no legal claim to the farmland, and all construction had to cease permanently. Furthermore, the judge found that Glendale Meadows, under Diane's leadership, had engaged in willful trespass and environmental violations. They would be subject to hefty fines, and I had the right to seek damages for the portions of my property they had already disturbed. When the news hit, the community erupted. Supporters congratulated me, thrilled that justice was served and that the farmland would remain in the hands of its rightful owner. The prospective mansion buyers were furious and demanded their deposits back. Glendale Meadows faced a tidal wave of legal and financial trouble. I heard rumors that Diane was scrambling to do damage control, calling in favors from her high-powered connection, but there was only so much she could do after such a decisive court ruling. The week following the judgment, the local press once again swarmed the farm, this time looking for a victory statement. I tried to keep it humble, explaining that it wasn't about beating an HOA, but preserving something that had been part of our family and the community for generations. However, behind closed doors, I felt an immense sense of satisfaction. I was sure my grandfather would be proud, knowing I honored his memory by protecting the land he cherished. I recalled one line from his notebook: "If they ever build without checking the boundaries, let the truth be your shield." That line had felt cryptic when I first read it, but now it rang with perfect clarity. Naturally, Diane's fall from grace was swift. Investors in Glendale Meadows turned on her, filing lawsuits to recoup their losses. The state cited the HOA for multiple environmental infractions, and local authorities initiated a deeper investigation into how she'd managed to push the project through without proper permits. It seemed everyone wanted to distance themselves from the fiasco. I'd be lying if I said I felt sorry for her. She threatened me, tried to bully me, and used every underhanded trick in the book to seize what wasn't hers. Yet, a small part of me also felt a pang of pity, wondering how someone could become so blinded by ambition that they thought they could overwrite decades of rightful ownership. In the months that followed, the farmland underwent a slow, careful restoration. Crews came in to remove the partially built mansions, wood frames, concrete foundations, all of it. Seeing those structures demolished should have brought me unbridled joy, but it was bittersweet. My grandfather taught me to appreciate everything that grows from the soil, whether it's crops, oak trees, or the wildflowers by the creek. Bulldozers and wrecking balls felt invasive, no matter how necessary. Still, there was a catharsis in watching the land gradually return to its original state. I worked with environmental experts to rehabilitate the creek bank where Glendale Meadows had dumped debris, replanting native grasses, and ensuring the wetlands could recover. As the farm began to resemble the place I remembered from my youth, I was overwhelmed by a sense of gratitude. Neighbors pitched in, volunteering their time and resources. They helped me remove trash, replant areas, and mend fences that had been torn down. One afternoon, Hank stopped by with a cooler of cold drinks for the volunteers. He sat on a tree stump sipping lemonade and watched the last remnants of one mansion's foundation being jackhammered away. "Your granddaddy's probably grinning from ear to ear," he said. "He always said the land would speak for itself if someone tried to stomp all over it." I felt tears prick the corners of my eyes. Even though my grandfather was gone, I felt his presence in every blade of grass. Within half a year, all visible traces of the Glendale Meadows project had disappeared. What remained was a rough patch of earth that needed time and care to heal. I made plans to reseed it with wildflowers, a tribute to my grandfather's gentle touch with the land. I also started considering ways to protect the farmland more concretely, perhaps a conservation easement, ensuring that no future developer could ever lay claim to it again. Marcia introduced me to some environmental groups who were eager to help preserve the wetlands. Their involvement felt right, a way to honor the property's natural heritage. Meanwhile, Diane all but vanished from the public eye. There was talk that she'd moved out of state to avoid the shame of multiple lawsuits. Glendale Meadows, the grand dream of building 50 mansions, became a local cautionary tale. Real estate expansions in our region cooled down as other developers took heed of the fiasco, and the HOA that had once seemed so unstoppable faced leadership changes and financial strain from the legal aftermath. Occasionally, I'd still get a curious visitor driving by, someone who'd heard about the farm's story and wanted to see the place where an HOA tried to build 50 mansions without checking the boundaries. They'd snap a photo of the rolling fields and ask me questions about how I managed to win. I never claimed I did it alone. It took legal expertise, supportive neighbors, environmental laws, and most of all, my grandfather's foresight. I told everyone who'd listen that the real hero was an old man who kept meticulous notes and loved his land enough to protect it from beyond the grave. The entire ordeal was a lesson not just for me, but for the whole community. We learned that greed and shortcuts eventually catch up with those who perpetrate them. We also discovered the power of unity as friends and neighbors rallied to defend a small piece of farmland that carried a century of history. I began opening the property to educational tours, inviting local schools to bring students out for nature lessons by the creek. Sometimes I'd hold a bonfire in the field where people could gather, roast marshmallows, and hear the story firsthand. It became a local legend. Remember when Diane's HOA tried to nab that farmland? They should have checked the boundaries. In truth, it was about more than boundaries. It was about respect. For the land, for the law, and for each other's heritage. If Diane had approached me with a legitimate proposal, willing to negotiate or listen to the local environmental concerns, maybe we could have found common ground. But she chose intimidation and deceit, ultimately sealing her own downfall. To me, the farmland was never about profit. It was about preserving a piece of Texas that my grandfather cherished. That's something no amount of mansion money could ever replace. A year after the final gavel fell, I held a small gathering at the farmhouse to celebrate the land's recovery. The air was full of laughter and the smell of barbecue. Folks brought homemade pies, potato salad, and sweet tea. Someone strummed a guitar on the porch, and kids ran circles around the yard, their joyful screams cutting through the twilight. As the sun set, I felt a deep sense of closure. I remembered my grandfather saying, "Land isn't just dirt, it's memory, family, and future rolled into one. When you stand up for it, you're standing up for everyone who came before and everyone who'll come after." I raised a glass to the open fields, silently thanking him for the guidance I once dismissed as overcautious. Neighbors told stories about how the farmland used to be a gathering spot for barn dances, how my grandfather hosted rummage sales there, letting folks from the community sell their goods without charging a fee. It hit me just how central this land had always been to the fabric of local life. Perhaps that was what irked Diane the most, that she wasn't just trying to take land, but a piece of our collective history. By the time we wrapped up the celebration, I had a renewed sense of purpose. I wanted to ensure that never again would someone like Diane get close to stealing what generations had lovingly tended. After everyone left, I stood by the creek, listening to the crickets and the gentle flow of water. I smiled at the sight of new reeds growing where the bulldozers had once rumbled. The wetlands were bouncing back, a quiet testament to nature's resilience. In that moment, I felt an overwhelming gratitude for the justice we had achieved. Then my mind drifted to the bigger picture. There are countless stories of people who lose their heritage to unscrupulous developers or manipulative organizations. Not everyone is lucky enough to find the right allies or the right evidence in time. That sobering thought made me vow to do more. I decided to partner with local legal aid clinics and environmental groups, sharing my story and resources to help others who might find themselves in similar predicaments. Over time, my life settled into a new rhythm, split between caring for the farmland and advocating for land protection. People sometimes referred to me as the farmhouse fighter, which made me grin. I wasn't a fighter by nature, but necessity had driven me to stand up for what was right, and in standing up I discovered a new sense of identity, one deeply rooted in my grandfather's legacy. It wasn't just about inheritance anymore. It was about using this experience to spark change. Whether that meant stricter oversight of HOAs or better education about property rights. I realized if one farmland dispute in a small Texas town could galvanize a community, maybe bigger reforms were possible. Months went by, and I found myself flipping through the old notebook again. One passage I'd overlooked before caught my eye. If we care for the land cares for us. But if we betray it, we betray our own future. I closed the notebook, thinking about how that summed up everything I'd been through. Diane had tried to exploit the land, ignoring laws, boundaries, and even environmental safeguards. In doing so, she betrayed a future that could have included a cooperative effort, possibly even a smaller development that respected the creek and local heritage. Instead, she ended up with lawsuits and a ruined reputation. My path, though rocky, reaffirmed my bond with the land and the community. I emerged stronger, with a clearer sense of purpose. That sense of purpose led me to finalize a conservation easement on part of the property, ensuring the wetlands and creek would remain protected from any future development attempts. I also invited local scouts to camp near the creek once it was deemed safe again. They helped plant native saplings, and in return they got to learn about the area's wildlife. The bright-eyed kids asked a million questions, and I realized how important it is to pass on knowledge about land stewardship to the next generation. In a way, it felt like a continuation of the neighborly spirit my grandfather embodied. He would have been thrilled to see the farm buzzing with activity, laughter, and genuine respect for nature. Then came the day I received a letter from Diane's attorney. It was brief, stating that Diane wished to settle any remaining disputes and avoid further escalation. She offered a sum of money to cover damages and inconvenience. Reading those words felt almost comical, considering the chaos she had unleashed. I spoke to Marcia, and she agreed it was a face-saving tactic. We decided not to respond directly. I didn't care about her money. The courts had already determined the path forward, and I had no interest in further entanglement with Glendale Meadows or her. If she truly wanted to make amends, she could pay the environmental fines and reimburse the prospective mansion buyers she'd misled. In the end, that letter went unanswered. Through it all, the local rumor mill churned. Some people insisted Diane was a scapegoat and that her real estate partners were the true masterminds. Others believed she'd orchestrated everything. Ultimately, the blame game didn't matter to me. What mattered was that the farmland remained in my name, untouched by half-baked development plans. The lawsuit with Glendale Meadows dragged on for a bit longer as the HOA tried to mitigate financial losses, but my portion of the legal battle was largely resolved. A sense of relief washed over me each time I drove up the country road and saw only the open field, the barn, and the stretch of mesquite trees. No more towering mansion frames intruding on the horizon. Friends sometimes teased me, saying I should build a mansion of my own, but I was content with the old farmhouse, its creaky floors, screened porch, and the memory of my grandfather in every room. I did invest in some repairs and modernizations, though, reinforcing the foundation and adding solar panels on the roof. It felt good to blend old and new, a nod to the farm's enduring legacy and a small step toward a sustainable future. Where Glendale Meadows had sought profit, I sought harmony. That difference, I realized, was at the core of our conflict. They saw the land as a commodity. I saw it as a living tapestry of history, community, and responsibility. Over time, the press coverage subsided. Life in town returned to normal. The farm carried on quietly, hosting the occasional neighborhood event, a charity cookout, or a nature workshop. I noticed that younger families started bringing their kids to see what a real farm looks like, free of glitzy marketing brochures. In those kids' wide-eyed wonder, I saw hope. Hope that the next generation might value authenticity over a quick buck. And that, to me, was the real victory. A year and a half after the fiasco, I found myself sitting by the creek on a warm afternoon, listening to the birds chattering in the reeds. I closed my eyes and felt a sense of peace that had been missing for a long while. The memory of that nightmarish confrontation with the security guard, the tense courtroom battles, and Diane's threatening words seemed distant. I took a deep breath and let it out slowly, thinking of my grandfather's final, unspoken lesson, that land is more than a plot of dirt with boundaries we draw. It's part of who we are and who we can become. If we let greed pave over that connection, we lose a piece of our humanity. That brings me to the core lesson I want to share with everyone who hears this story. True ownership isn't just about a deed or a survey line. It's about stewardship, respect, and the willingness to protect what's valuable, not just to ourselves but to the community and the generations that follow. When an HOA or any powerful group tries to bulldoze its way through boundaries without caring for the land or its rightful guardians, they set themselves up for a monumental fall. The earth has a voice, and so do its people, especially those rooted in history and bound by genuine love for the place they call home. Never doubt that a single determined individual, armed with facts, community support, and a righteous cause, can stand up to the mightiest Goliath. That's exactly what happened here. A small farmhouse, a handful of old documents, and a family's legacy proved stronger than the lure of 50 glittering mansions. And while the fight was hard and sometimes frightening, it revealed the best in neighbors who came together, the unwavering dedication of people like my lawyer Marcia, and the quiet triumph of an environment allowed to heal. So if you ever find yourself facing a battle that seems too big to win, remember this farmland and the people who rallied around it. Remember my grandfather's words about letting truth be your shield. Stand your ground, gather evidence, and never let intimidation silence you. Because when you fight for something that genuinely matters, for family heritage, for natural beauty, for the spirit of a community, you're not just defending a piece of property. You're defending hope, continuity, and the essence of what makes a place worth living in. That's a fight worth waging every single time. And in the end, if you persevere, you just might find that the biggest bullies have built their castles on sand. Castles that crumble the moment real truth, love, and unity step up to the plate.